Today, we are joined by a true expert in colour and virtual production with a career spanning roles at Technicolor and Method Studios. He has led groundbreaking innovations in colour science, virtual production, and LED volume technology. His work includes mastering pipelines for Unreal Engine, Brompton Tech, and film like Baselight, alongside cinematography credits like Formula One and BBC dramas. So perfect guest to explore the art and science of colour in virtual production filmmaking. Welcome, Dan Mulligan.
Thank you, sir. Very good introduction, and pleasure to be here.
Yeah, pleasure for you to be here. Pleasure for us to have you. I think that's what I'm trying to say. So first of all, thanks for joining us.
That's all.
Do you want to introduce Dan Mulligan to everyone? Where do you come from? What's your history?
Well, I started off way back when as a camera truck driver. So I kind of got my start in the camera department, driving camera vans around, and then worked my way through that kind of in the late 80s, early 90s, that sort of route into loading film, focus pulling, and going through that sort of routines. My first gig was camera operator with many years experience. Said, Dan, I'd like to do this shot. It's one of these things you never forget, right? Your first kind of shot as a camera operator, and it was just a sort of spinning thing in a room, overhead, and started there. So luckily I had a good eye for framing, and the sort of career kind of got on the rails from that point onwards, loading film, focus pulling, camera operating, and then segued into, got offered a job at Formula One. So travelled around with them as a cameraman, official Formula One cameraman, and was in the pit lane. Back in those days, you had fuel stops. So you had a fire suit on and camera on your shoulder. There's only one or two of you in the pit lane during the race, purely because of the danger. So you're going to have 20 cameramen running around, and then there's a global feed. So from that point, so you have like a guy got a pole man finding the signal. So you're running up and down the pit lane and doing all the same today, but just the difference was we had the fuel stops. So there's a bit of an extra element of danger there, I guess. So we had fire suits on with fire masks. So it was quite a sort of hot environment in the sense of running up and down for those 2 hours. So you get a bit of downtime anyway, of course, because cars are doing their thing for 15 laps. You just kind of chill out.
Yeah. So what was the tech that was involved in that? Was it film when you first started, or?
No, it's digibeaters. So it was Sony digibeaters, 709s, 790 cameras. We had tape backups, but it was all umbilical cords and sort of live feeds. So although the cameras were digibeaters and kind of traditionally would be camcorder type cameras, but for news gathering, ENG work and that type of thing, those were pretty much the default sort of cameras for live broadcast too, for running around with a camera on your shoulder style. The other cameras were Thompsons, all fixed around the circuit, predetermined positions. The two or three of us that were running around, we had digibeaters, so they were portable sort of little recording cameras with a zoom lens, and you'd run around, take a white balance off the tarmac. So it was kind of close to 18% grey of all things. And then you'd just be cut live. You'd have cans on with director going, live to camera one, and just keep the shot steady. And then when they're out, you leg it up to the next thing that's happening behind you, or your co-worker taps you on the shoulder. Go and have a look at this up here. So very energetic. Yeah. So you're on that sort of doing everywhere. And we were official cameramen, so we did every race. So we went around, did all of them. So that meant we got to know the product very well. And then as you're a global feed, you get the host broadcaster will buy that feed from us as sort of F1 digital. So that's how all the live pictures for the pit stops would go up.
And how old were you at this?
I was in my 20s then. So,
wow.
Yeah, I know, not a bad little number to have. So I kind of went from driving vans, and before that I was a drummer in rock bands. And then after moving on from that, just naturally moved on and got into camera operating and DOP work for BBC, and then worked up to features. Got into second unit sort of work as a DOP, and during that stage, as that was growing and that career was building, the kind of digital film sort of switch over, you could, or personally, I could see coming from quite a distance. The reason being, good friends of mine were stills photographers at the time, so they were getting 1D backs. And this is going back quite a step now when I think about it, but at that time was digital for stills, film digital switch over happened to kicked in and quite a bit before film.
Yeah.
And of course, the backs, what was happening was cameras like Hasselblads would have, companies would design new backs. So it'd be 10 megapixels or whatever, then it'd be 20, then 30. So these things were costing thousands. They were very expensive. So I kind of saw that. I thought, well, this is going to happen with film. My background was film loading and, dark Hands Intense and all the dark rooms and getting to focus. So I kind of thought that this is getting close to it when digital itself as a 24 frames per second environment going to sort of switch to digital. And for me, it kind of started with the Viper camera from Thompson that sort of came out in the early 2000s. Although before that, there was HD cameras. Sony had this HD can't remember the nomenclature now. It wasn't a 790, but it's very similar, 1030 or something. But it's an 1080p camera, but it's progressive segmented frame. So it's join the frames to give you sort of 25p. And so I bought one of those cameras just to, as you do. And that's how I got did a lot of BBC dramas, because at that time there was a 16mm, there was a kickback to switch from 16mm to HD production. So I kind of got into that rhythm of doing that work. And then I saw the Viper come out and I thought, well, this is now digital film. There was quite a well-known advert at the time for Heineken that Brad Pitt was in, if I recall correctly. And it was kind of the first advert or piece of cinematography you saw with that digital film production, with the lighting, the cinematography, the whole kind of feel of it. And then David Fincher, Collateral, started shooting, and then David Fincher picked up the Viper, then the Genesis, and it started to grow. And in those kind of early years in the mid-2000s to 2010-ish, then the Red came out, and that kind of, it all started to sort of grow some legs. So I got in early enough that I became one of those guys that said, well, if you're going to do digital dailies and it was all DPXs with 16 terabyte RAIDs, and it was all HD, and we couldn't even do that in real time, which sounds crazy now, but it's, it's the overhead we had and the kit available. It could even put LUTs on your sort of raw rushes, and the Viper was peculiar. Yeah, well, the LUTs, the dot cubes are pretty standard now. They only worked in certain software, so you had sort of luster and different software. So the LUTs available at that time weren't cross-compatible with other software. It wasn't because they were trying to not do it. It just didn't quite happen just yet. So you had to, and the Viper had a very odd green patina because of its raw nature. So a lot of photography at the time, you would put a 30cc magenta filter on the front of the lens to take away a bit of the green, kind of. And then you had a bit of infrared infiltration came in a little bit with digital sensors. So there was these IRND filters, kind of soften the infrared infiltration that would affect the blacks. So your blacks would have quite a strong magenta bias. So all that sort of learning, I kind of really picked up on how digital cinematography and the color and how it all works and what are these sensors doing and why we're getting these edges on the exposure mountain ranges. So they have high contrast ratio differences. You'd get a little pixel line it couldn't expose, and then you had to map the pixels and different software. Other people have stories very similar, and so there's quite a lot of sophisticated software at the time to kind of fix a few things. But this was kind of an adventure that we all kind of took at that time. And then, of course, it all started to gather. And then once probably in very simple terms, the Alexa came out and the Red was there as well, it kind of blew into more of digital cinematography became a very much the standard way of working. So I became one of those guys that was the first doing very much the very early area raw shoots. The first one in Australia, the first one in Chile, Santiago, shooting to SRW on tape and that kind of thing. So that kind of then got me into that world. And then Technicolor said, we need an expert like you to run our coming from film to digital. So they took me on as a sort of digital front end expert. And so I started looking after their shows globally. And from that point, I just sort of understood color and how it works within the digital with LUTs and, all the kind of ways of getting dailies out. That kind of then saw me get into color science and just naturally progressed into VF. It sounds odd, but kind of went into VFX and, I was offered jobs as we need somebody with color expertise because of digital plates, VFX plates, color workflows. And then I got into that kind of, and hence as things have progressed and we've gone through a few things, 3D's come and gone a little bit. And then we kind of, as digital's grown and gone through different kind of iterations, I sort of ended up at this juncture, sort of understanding color with LED tiles and virtual production and how that works.
Were there many, when you first started getting into color and, those organizations were reaching out to you, were many people doing what you were doing? Illustrator, were you one of like a handful, or were there just tons of people?
I guess so. It's a good question. There was probably 2 or 3 DITs that started before it sort of blew into becoming a very common way of working, and a couple of DITs would work with only certain DOPs because they were kind of preferred. They're regular people. So the work was fairly common, but the people available weren't as common at that time. So if you had a reputation or people knew you, and in the early days of digital, when the Vipers and the Genesis and those cameras were kind of sort of being used and used on tentpole movies once in a while, Get Smart, I remember, and Apocalypto shooting on the Genesis, shooting to tape,
right,
not to disc. So
wow,
so it's compressed. People would reach out to you from the larger studios, go, hey Dan, we want to get our dailies going. I said, well, if you get an XD cam disc and hook it up with a Firewire converter, you can crash play and crash record your dailies to that, and then you got a disc with you. You can start playing with those as you're kind of offline. So there was a little bit of a kind of a camaraderie in those that kind of got it and understood it a bit quicker than those that were still working for big companies. There was a lot of freelancers, and that sort of brains trust was quite exciting. Looking back now, we were all experimenting and learning off each other, right? So nobody was losing out or nobody was winning, but it was all kind of going, well, that's a really cool way of thinking about it. And we all just adapted. But then as more people got involved, it grows and stabilizes, which is one of the things we discuss about virtual production. Then some way of standardized kind of approach to the workflows started to get adopted. So then productions would do the same thing over and over and over again and rinse and repeat certain ways of doing dailies. But you'd always have a custom element. If you chose Final Cut Pro or Avid as your editorial, that's always a decision that affects what happens afterwards. So not a big deal, but you still got to make a journey and do your workflow. So we started doing the workflow charts and that kind of thing.
So, and then what was that sort of transition from that work that you were doing, and then suddenly someone has this bright idea and goes, oh, there are these LED panels that we think we'll put up, and then we're going to filming. Because how hard could that be? How hard could that be, Dan?
How hard could that be? Well, just to go back a step, I did a lot of work as a cinematographer for live concerts in the 2000s. So jumbo screens, and we've all seen them. So you got the big screens up and you're zooming in on whoever, Metallica or whatever band you're kind of filming on the day. And so the event can be seen by the audience way back on these giant screens. So that was a very common way of working. So a lot of sort of green screen and back projection and things were done in a reasonably Gravity in 2012. Did a lot of work that's very similar to what we do now, but it was just at that point, everyone went into that pot and did it all. Where now there's a lot more sort of people working in a similar sort of space. I think yeah.
So what you just to play that back. So what the experience was first virtual production was filming live a concert that had a LED wall in the background. Would that be right?
Kind of. It wasn't quite, because it was just the fact it was live. The technology was there for what it was doing, was jumbo screens and in Formula One the same, but so the crowd could see the race while the cars were over the other side of the circuit. So it's interesting seeing that early tile technology to what we're doing now, photorealism, film narrative. So the technology's evolved to allow more accuracy and more sort of narrative kind of way of working. So then things evolved into putting foregrounds, using those screens as backgrounds, and then combining that sort of that workflow. So it's kind of
let's get that in, let's get into that in part two. Before we finish part one, a few questions. Right. So I'm asking some standard questions of the guests that come on the podcast. The first one is, in as few words as possible, what is virtual production?
Well, I've got my sort of colour hat on, but I'm not going to go into like a whole essay. But so as I'm sort of cribbing my notes here, for me, virtual production, LED walls allowing scenes to be deployed in the background with foreground elements, allowing a blend of such elements to coexist, and thus allowing a complete scene to be recorded in one sequence or set of takes. So that's kind of my take on VP as a way of working. Then the colour kind of bits, just a sentence, accuracy aligned to a narrative story arc in many respects, demanding photorealism, ensuring scenes appear real or based in the real world. So you've got to kind of, as I kind of see it, I'm sure many others do as well, the film narrative is based on does background scene and the volume look like this, what I've got behind me? And does this bit match that bit? And can it all coexist? So you've got the color element, which is one side of it, which we'll go through. But the virtual production allows you to then have perhaps this scene that we're seeing here, this kind of anywhere that you've got your volume. And then that allows a little bit of flexibility or a lot of flexibility in hotels, local crew, other overheads can be kind of addressed accordingly.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, you definitely hit the nail on the head. It really is that coexistence between the two. You want to I think that's the whole point of telling stories in film as well, right? It's like you're immersing the viewer in something and not giving them an uncanny feeling about something not being quite right and up in a jarring. You want them completely engrossed and entertained by what they're watching. Cool. So, couple more. What is the most common misconception people have about virtual production?
My own take on this is kind of coming from my background as a color scientist doing VFX plates. So rather than a broader sort of approach, I've kind of written down for me is ICVFX. I think that's to me is one of the misconceptions that in-camera VFX is in-camera VFX. It's plates. It's not quite there yet. And so for me, it's the perception or the principle of recording full plates or ICVFX is how I've written it. Having worked as a color scientist in VFX for many years, distributing plates for vendors, color accuracy and pipelines was extremely important. So the job as a color scientist for VFX plates was to distribute them all accurately, so that by the time the work's done and they come back, everything's color-wise is completely correct. I think that it's just the in-camera VFX. Perhaps it's just the terminology. It can I think, misconstrue or misconception, perhaps, that you're doing a full finished plate in the camera with your wall, and they're not. That's not quite there yet with your scene delivery and that media assets in the background, the camera, and all the bits we may discuss about how that relationship lives and breathes from a color point of view. It's still perhaps just a bit more hybrid. The bits can be and then joined together later. So, things can go wrong, and to have a fully accurate finished plate in camera on set there and then, I'm sure there's plenty of production that have done it, but that's my take on a misconception that it's just click the switch and it all just create these wonderful kind of finished plates straight away. So it's a lot of work involved. So that'll evolve and it will be there, but that's the slight misconception, I think.
Gotcha. Last one before we go to the break. Can you remember what your aha moment was when you first realized that, well, actually this is a thing? This could be a thing.
Well, it's my sort of light bulb moment because of thinking of color. I thought, how do we make these tiles or the technology, having been a photographer for sort of live concerts, and I'm not saying that there's a direct correlation here, but just having that knowledge and background and realizing that strong purples and oranges is part of the show, the theatre of the live concert. The accuracy of those colors was obviously not of an importance, but then I was thinking, well, hold on, we've got a narrative story arc here. Boy meets girl and meets in cafe and falls in love. There's a kind of element of the color that needs to be considered more accurately and more realistic from that point of view. And that's kind of what got me thinking around 2020. How are we addressing those kind of environments? So I've been addressing them for many years with plates anyway, and green screens and comping and all the other bits of the pipeline. I thought, this is kind of interesting now. If you're going to do all this in camera in front of a wall, how accurate is the wall? How accurate is the camera's ability to talk to the wall? So that was me kind of in my own mind going, wow, this is fascinating. And then, of course, once you started to dig into it, or I started to dig into it myself, the spectral offsets, maybe we'll cover that later, but
I'm sure
in the early days, it was quite, there was some great tests that were done. Paul Deverbeck did some great ones with the Hawaiian shirts, and you could see those offsets and the skin tones going off. So that all of that sort of started to come to the party. I was going, wow, this is really interesting. We kind of need to really start looking at this, perhaps a bit more accurately from that point of view.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay. Well, thank you for that. We're going to catch up again in part 2. So we're going to catch up again in part 2. So we're just going to go for a quick break, and we'll be back soon. Welcome back, Dan.
Thank you.
So in part 2, I just wanted to talk a bit more about actually where you think what the status of color, and where do you think the status of LED, using LED volumes for filmmaking is?
It's evolving quite fast. It's certainly become more, the color science side of virtual production is becoming more a sort of a requirement to be understood better. There's more sort of interest from unreal operators, especially to understand color better, as it's now more people are on set working or closer to the photography. There's a kind of things don't look right. The interesting thing about color is it's very like a painting, like anything that you watch as a human being. With these eyes and our kind of ability to see as human beings, if it doesn't look right, it's unseeable from that moment onwards to some degree. So you can be on set and kind of go, there's something not quite right about this. Not because there's anything wrong with the scene that's being built. It's just maybe it's a bit green or a bit magenta, or it's just that the color's off. And so in the early days, we had this issue with spectral offsets and just a spectral locus, and the way the human visual sort of system works compared to how a camera and this technology works. So we got a kind of an interesting area of human beings looking at what technology can do, and they're not, humans and cameras aren't seeing the same thing in the same kind of way in many, many respects. So the technology, the tile technology and the camera technology is evolving quite exponentially, quite fast to address those kind of color issues that the human being is seeing, but that the technology is perhaps not quite aware of where these issues are coming from until you're further down the track in your pipeline. And then you can go, oh, wow, it's kind of, now that it's amplified, we can see that there's an issue. And of course, with color, with virtual production, it touches all of it, from the cables to the GPUs, to the processors, to the whole journey, to the tile, to the camera, to the sensor, to the lights, to the lenses, to the comp, to the whole chain of commands. It gets sprinkled with color, which doesn't mean that's the quarterbacking of the whole pipeline. It's just one element of it, but it does sprinkle itself around all of that. And of course, color inherently, not each individual small component, is fairly simple to kind of understand. The concepts aren't too hard, but there's so many of them. There's just so many elements that need to be correct and get in line. So the importance of color in many respects, the way that it's sort of adopted for virtual production is the accuracy and the correctness of it. It will save you time and money later because nothing needs to be fixed. So there's an element to, I suppose there's one way of looking at it, is lens tests. Back in the day as a DOP, especially when I was shooting film, you would do lens tests at the camera rental facility to decide which lenses are working or are wrong, because you can't really afford to have a bad lens on a high production, because it's just you have to get rid of that and get another one in. It costs time and money. So you could argue there's a bit of an element of the walls, the tiles and their accuracy is important, because everything will just need to be fixed and worked on later at some point, because once that timeline is created, and again, these are broad brushstrokes, everything needs to sort of match in very simple terms. If it's not matching originally because your photography is dependent on the background matching the foreground, and if they're not matching, and then you can see there's a sort of law of butterfly effect where it kind of affects a lot of other stuff later that you may be bringing into your timeline. So So what I've written down here, just for the important side of it, a bit of a dry response, I'm afraid, in many respects, is
No, it's fascinating.
the colour's the glue that sort of binds it all together in many respects. Outside of all of that, a massive equipment and everything else, it touches the entire pipeline, as I said, from the cables, GPU servers, processors, tiles, scenes, Unreal, OCIO, all the other factors that kind of that put that sort of color accuracy into the right areas, tone mappers, viewports, all these sort of environments. All of these individually can be addressed quite readily and fairly easily, but join them all together, you've got a whole pipeline of stuff that needs addressing and fixing. And perhaps that's one of the areas with color and virtual production, is it's quite a wider pipeline, and it's sort of small chunks of it. You've got to get it, a lot of it, quite accurate for it all to work in situ.
Yeah, I was just sort of in my head. I love an analogy, and I was watching something the other day about shuffling decks of cards. Bear with me on this. Whenever you shuffle a deck of cards, there's 52 cards in it, right? As we know, there is a incredibly high probability that it has never been in that order ever before. And in actual fact, the computations of the different ways a deck of cards could be shuffled is more atoms than even in the universe, or something mad like that, right? And it sort of springs to mind that you're in that game a bit, because there are so many different variables within, from the PC that's running this. I guess the color that someone selected for the texture on an object in Unreal Engine, and how that is being processed by the GPU and then going through the video card, and as you say, down the cables and into the thing, and then further down, and it's all going round to an LED, a single point of an LED that the camera needs to look at and understand what it is.
Yeah, and all of that, like you said, that the kind of deck of cards analogy. Sometimes you could just take one, sort of not error, but just to kind of, we tick that box, and then the boxes that you've ticked afterwards are now a complete irrelevance, because everything will concatenate in it. So it's just the journeys are wrong, I suppose, in another analogy. If you start your journey from Brighton to Scotland and you go up the wrong motorway, you're in Oxford, it's very, one single decision has changed your whole journey for the whole day. Perhaps not the best analogy, but
I get it.
But you've got to get it right, because it's in many respects it's quite binary, isn't it? In the sense that will affect that. If you don't get that and that correct, it's going to affect the wrong thing, which is very common with computers, because they need to be quite accurate in how they communicate certain bits of information. But you load up something that manages that information and it distributes it and everything works, but it's distributing it to the wrong areas. So then they deck a cards, so the poor magician goes, pick any, he's expecting it to be card number 16. Number 16 is suddenly the 8 of clubs, and he was like, I wasn't expecting that. It's meant to be the 6 of diamonds, wasn't it? So it's kind of...
Where's your gut feeling of where virtual production is?
Well, at this stage, I suppose I'm going to sort of go back half a step, is that the accuracy part of a virtual production, as it stands today, before things develop, there's still quite a few more elements that add into the pipelines. Things like your spectral locus, though, that knocks onto your color space. Your working space is one decision. Once you've decided you're going to work in, say, Rec 2020 or DCI P3, then everything has to kind of live in that world to some degree, or the journey, that the communication of it. Of course, with things like Unreal, it defaults to sRGB because it's computer sort of space. It's just normal. So it's quite common that perhaps you double sRGB, for example, is quite a common thing, or you sort it in sRGB space, but you sort of tell it to do it again. So you're kind of creating a slight sort of small error there. And if it's Rec 709, they're the same primaries being the primary RGB colors, and their kind of chromaticity numbers are identical. It's just a gamma shift in the 2.2 to 2.4 what causes those to look different. So those two very common color spaces, those two options could open up the power of 2 times 2 is 4 is 16, 32. Suddenly you've got a potential error set from a very simple starting point that ends up becoming exponentially up to 1,000 potential kind of touch points that all get erroneously tagged because you've just ticked one wrong box here or that box unfortunately has decided to talk to that box over there. And you end up with a kind of color pipeline then that becomes erroneous. What you get in isn't what you're getting out, in simple terms.
Right.
So, but then you add all of the bits that are available to you, Unreal scenes, scene delivery, media assets, all the ways that the color pipeline can be managed and controlled. So there's just an accuracy not only to the color but to the pipeline itself. So you've got a sort of a double hit in many respects.
And do you think, are you confident that is going to be fixed with the development of software, hardware?
I think it'll get better. We've already got development in software. So it's Sony and Arri, for example, with their color calibration software that they've sort of developed in the last year or so. OpenVP Cal to kind of sort of match the volume to how your camera output can see it. So at this stage, you've got to make sure that at least as a minimum, your volume, your tiles can accurately, or as accurate as they possibly can, to recreate your working color space you've chosen to working. So you want to make sure your volume is as lined up in as color accurate as possible, so that when the camera then talks to it, you're ruling out the volume being off. So if the volume's off, you can have the camera talking to the volume accurately, but if what the volume's doing is inaccurate, it's just trying to work with something that's already broken. So you've got to make sure that it's all chain is all kind of communicating, because you can have a lovely plug-in down the track that fixes stuff, but if what you're putting into it is already broken, that plugin becomes, null and void in many respects, because it's not working with something that it's expecting to be accurate going in.
As some people might know, I mean, my experience with virtual reduction is mainly using chroma keying. I really enjoy using chroma key live in cameras. All the love of virtual reduction, but without the complexity of an LED wall. And it is exactly the same, because there's a misconception, I think, that you can treat it just as if you treat a normal green screen shoot that would always go into VFX. As long as there's a bit of green behind it, it's fine. Whereas actually, if you're able to get an incredibly flat green for your shot, it gives the Ultimat, which is the bit of kit that I use to create. So if you don't know, Ultimat is a keyer, and the keyer, when it looks at an image, it'll look at anything, and if it's either green or blue, those are the two key colors. Normally green, because there's less green in people's skin, I believe. That's the main reason for it. And if anything, it sees green of a particular green as well, it will turn into an alpha channel, which basically means then you can put a backplate behind it. And it sometimes surprises me that you need to have that switch flicked on to say, make sure your green's really good, because it gives all of the technology after it it's so much easier for it to work with.
Absolutely. And you've just reminded me of chroma keying. And when I was lighting, that was the thing. You've got to get a flat background. So setting up your studio, and so one of the elements that's causing some sort of potential color issues, of course, the amount of capability of a tile to see a certain percentage of the color space you've chosen to work within. So if you've got Rec 2020, a lot of tiles, certainly a year ago, but things are developing with RGB, WW, and, kind of LEDs that can be dialed in a bit like the KinoFlows mimics and what have you, sort of dial the sort of offsets in and kind of get some more color accuracy. But the percentage of your color space that you're recording is dictated to by the technology of the tile in many respects. If you choose to go HDR and Rec 2020 and the nits and all these common nomenclature that people sort of discuss quite readily, if you're only sort of seeing 88%, just to pick a number, of the Rec 2020 color space, so your RGBs are already kind of limited in, you're not getting 100% of your color fidelity, you're going to get in 80% of it. You're already restricted in what's going to be sort of displayed on the screen, and you've got a danger of things going out of Gamut and things of that nature. With Rec 709, just as an example, you can get close to 99, 100% of the available colors in that color space will then be reproduced on a 10-bit tile at a certain dynamic range, because you're restricted by the 10 bits. So there's quite a strong element of the technology itself is part of the whole equation, and no criticism in it. It's just one of those things. There you go. So you've got your color spaces, and what you've got here is the spectral locus, like the kind of the straight line at the bottom there with the dome. But the spectral locus is the visual spectral locus, NM values wavelengths essentially. So the numbers you see going up and down the sides represent those wavelength values. So the color space that then lives within that spectral locus is what you see here. So sRGB and Rec 709 are very close. They're the same primaries. And your D65 white point is fixed. That's color temperature 6500, which is a Kelvin measurement. So that D65 white point won't change in this example, but your color spaces, or the amount of colors available to you to play with and see and record, does.
So am I right in saying Rec 709 is what humans see, or is as close to what humans see? Is that
No, not quite. What the human's seeing is this spectral locus. It's seeing more colors, but in our way of seeing them, if that makes sense. What you've got here with sRGB, especially the red, green and blue, is computer space. It is the ability to put those colors in a space you could see on a computer screen. So you've got a slightly less, the screens can only do so much. This is going back many, many, many years. Obviously technology has improved and monitors can sort of see more of a particular color space and render the colors that are recorded within that space much more accurately as technology has progressed. So essentially, in very simple terms, the wider the color space, ergo your wider gamut for the camera, not the same, but you see that the more colors you record, the more accurate the rendition of your scene will be. But the display that you're watching it on, your TV at home, can only put Rec 709 colors on it, but you've recorded everything in Rec 2020, which has got way more color recorded. You're already reducing the ability for what you're seeing on that screen from what you've recorded. That's a very simple way of looking at it. So the idea is to record more colors, hence a wider color space, such as Rec 2020, which is seeing more colors in your RGB primaries than Rec 709 is. But yeah, there's kind of histories for projection space. P3 Protocol 3 and DCI is a digital cinema initiative. So this is sort of going back a few steps in the days of screen projections for your cinema. The P3 space, because of the way that the foot lambs and reflections of the screen worked at that time, the P3 space was adopted for projection because it gave you more accurate representation of what you've done, although this is going down the track. So that color space, the primaries or the way you track your primaries is one thing, but it's at the moment, again, in a very broad brushstroke way, the wider the color space, the more colors get put in, like a house. The bigger the house, the bigger the room, the more, or a bucket, you can fill it up with more color information.
Right. So you got more to play with, basically, in the color grading, right? Is that what we're effectively?
Well, yes. If you're recording in film space, or you were recording digitally an exterior with sunlight, and you set it up to wide gamut, and you decide to work in a certain color space, that wide gamut is quite a lot of colors. It's usually beyond the spectral locus in many respects, because it's recording a very wide bandwidth of colors, a big color information. But then that all gets reduced as you start grading, and then your display referred kind of environment reduces what you've recorded. You can only see so much, and all these factors, again, this is all broad brushstroke kind of stuff. But once you start manipulating and massaging those environments to get the most colors out of your color space that you've recorded in, aligned to the gamut of the camera and how it sees red, greens and blues and how it looks at things, then you've got the raw photography and other things coming to play, logarithmic curves and Cineon. It all starts to, your color pipeline, everything starts to layer up quite quickly. Like your deck of cards analogy, you've suddenly got 2 decks of cards. So you're sort of exponentially kind of adding a lot, but at the end of the day, you want it as color accurate as possible. So the more information you have, the more dynamic range, the more the blacks and whites, and then all those equations all start to come into play.
But fundamentally, that's to ensure that they can color grade to what they want to do.
Yeah,
is that right? Would that be right?
Yeah, well, the grader wants as much color available as possible to
Right.
be able to push and pull those colors around to their own designs, especially if you're going to introduce some saturation and other things in contrast. As soon as you add any contrast, you're going to pop the saturation out and your colors a tiny bit. And all of that needs to be either pulled in or accentuated in certain areas. So you really want to be, especially with HDR and sort of nits and tiles. So this sort of takes it, with film itself, film space, it's recorded a hell of a lot of color information where unfortunately a camera has the ability to record a lot of color information, but the tile technology as it stands isn't pushing out enough color information to fill the bucket up completely.
To fill the bucket. God,
it's only sort of 88% full. So you're already, and then with adding 10-bit technology, the 10 bits, the bits that are available will only allow so much information to be pushed out of the LED screen. So
interesting.
It all starts to kind of, there's a sort of push and pull me effect. And to get the best out of all of the technology with your camera and lens choice and the volume choice, the tiles you've chosen, the pixel pitch, the color space, the percentage of it, the job of a color scientist is to measure all that.
Got you.
So that's where we come in from a sort of scientific point of view, to put it in brackets, measuring chromaticity responses. I can then measure and say, this is what you're getting from this particular color space, and this is how accurate the colors will be within that space from the tile. So you're seeing, and then once you've lined up your volume and made sure it's as accurate as it can be, now we can get into the camera calibration to that volume to make sure that the camera is now seeing that accuracy as accurately as it can.
Gotcha.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I think that's brilliant and great for explaining it for sure. So we're going to break for the end of part 2. And in part 3, which will be coming in a minute, we're going to be talking about why we should care about this and who should care about it. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, Mr. Mulligan. So part 3 really is why we should care. So maybe talk a little bit about who cares about this.
Because it comes down to many kind of elements of producers and costs and saving time and money to a DOP's vision for accuracy of color and rendition and skin tones and things as any stills photographer or any cinematographer has got their passion and their authorship of the quality of the images that are being created alongside the producer's wish for it to all happen quickly and as accurately as possible from a color point of view, which is completely fair, which is why I guess I use that analogy of the lens testing. You could one example of what we're doing with our companies is factory acceptance testing on tiles. When you test a tile at the factory, is it doing the same thing we've just tested at the factory is going to do when it's in your volume in a studio? So again, it's just proving that what you've bought at the factory it's absolutely the same as what you can tick that box and it's comfort for the customer. So there's a lot of kind of moving parts in who cares and why should we care? I suppose, and another part of it. What I've written down here is if you've calibrated your volume and like you've tested your lenses and these have been rejected and these have been accepted, the production and the insurance company are going to go, that production has got a tick from us to continue onwards because we know those lenses and they'll get fixed and you've got good glass because you've tested it and you do weave tests on film. So say you put that analogy into LED volumes, you want to make sure they're as color accurate as possible. It will just save time and money later. It makes sense that and the DOP knows that the work that they're doing within that space, within that tile space aligned to the camera and the lights, it's another part of the pulse spectral offsets sort of conundrum, is going to be the color accuracy part of it then becomes something that you don't have to kind of consider or worry about later. And if the colors are off, sometimes it's not obvious straight away to a human being to see that the colors are inaccurate. It's the technology sees it differently later down the track. Then it becomes obvious to the human vision. It's not really cyan or it's just gone off. So to remove all those potential sort of pratfalls for later, just to use that sort of phrase, you want to make sure that everything's as color accurate as it possibly can be, because then the time needed and the kind of get on set, we know that this volume's accurate, which we've done many times. It gives the client confidence and it means I can just shoot quicker. Should not be any issue. Then from a detective hat's point of view, if there is an issue with the color, it can't be the volume because it's been calibrated. It has to be
So,
something else.
so is it, is it the producer that really needs to really care about it? Properly. That is down to them.
A little bit, it's part of it, and the customer too. The customer that's buying a volume, you want to make sure that if you're buying a set of lenses, that if you're going to spend £500 on a set of prime lenses, you kind of know that they're not going to be that accurate, but you're accepting the caveats. But if you buy £100,000 worth of Zeiss master primes, they better be 100% on it, and you test them, and then so if you just bought a volume and for a year it's just completely been color inaccurate, it's that's the customer buying the wall to use in a studio. Then the production comes in, and then their requirements then layer over the top of those requirements of the producer. Is it color accurate? Have you got a certificate? Can we make sure? Because then they can just get on with the other 1,000 things that need to be kind of ticked.
So the studio or the person or the organization that is going to commercialize an LED wall for filmmaking, it's super important for them to be able to have that tick, to be able to say confidently that this thing does X, Y, and Z. So there are no surprises. And the producer won't ever be surprised because everyone knows that it is ticked a particular box.
Absolutely. And of course, the customer's buying their tiles, and they have a choice on that. So they may decide that the price for the color accuracy that's been proven, because it's been tested to pixel pitch to other factors, is one thing. But we're doing a project that doesn't require so much of that. So then they can pitch their purchase accordingly for their business model. The person that's then using that particular volume then would like to know that it's as color accurate as possible, because then they don't have to worry about doing more tests or kind of doing, then you've got the Unreal operators, and there's all of the other side of the kind of the coin of virtual production that they don't want to be dicing too much with OCIO configs, and kind of, they want to say, well, if you just click this working space, this is going to be pretty accurate. So that's probably a nice place to be from the psychology of it, as much as the actual working practice of it. It saves time and money.
And what's the difference between? Well, I guess there's a very difficult question to ask actually, and I was about to ask sort of what's the difference between a very, very color accurate LED wall at the moment versus one that will do. But I suppose that's as long as a piece of string, right?
Well, there's so many moving parts to the purchase, to it working, and history, and older tiles, and newer technology, and processors, and GPUs, and things working faster, 10-bit, 12-bit, the color space you choose. So I'm kind of backdrafting to what we were discussing at the start of the conversation, that you can see there's just so many moving parts when it comes to color. All of them individually aren't particularly onerous, but add them all together, you're right. You've got like those 2 or 3 decks of cards you need to and get it all kind of, all in sync and it correct. And then once that marriage is solidified, that will probably stay solid for a long, long time, because the communication's right and you've got it all set up. With it, that's kind of one of the challenges. If you've got old software, or you've got a GPU that's 5 years old, it's not going to be able to do what you want, because it hasn't got the guts to kind of drive the video. It's a video wall, very sophisticated one. So it needs a lot of bandwidth, a lot of technology bandwidth to drive these things accurately. To get, imagine the power draw and the things like electricity kind of pulsing and moving the way it does can have an effect on the way that things, and you've got brightness levels. So again, this sort of very broad brushstroke color discussion, you could see where you could easily have 2 or 3 more discussions about certain elements of the color pipe, and you could have a good 1-hour discussion just about color spaces and how they would be adopted and work within. You could have another one on the processors and Brompton and Megapixel and Novastar and others, that how do they best work, and what would be a best color pipeline practice from that point, because you've got a journey to take.
So who's actually responsible for that? Who is responsible for the color?
I know, I remember going back to when LTO started as a backup device for digital cinematography. Insurance companies like Eon that I dealt with at the time, can we insure your product if you're backing it up to LTO? It's a new way of, these are tapes you used in banks. They were meant to be there for storing digital files of a movie. So skip forward, say 25 years, and you say, well, where does that kind of tick from the insurance company to say, is your volume color accurate? If it is, great. It's insured. I don't know if they've got to that point yet, maybe 2 or 3 years away from that environment as people learn and understand the technology better. But it's like anything. If you had a camera that's 50 years old and just about works, and you got it because it was free, or would you want the new spanking new one? The insurance company would always want the new one, but we can't afford it. We're a small production. We're not.
Yeah.
Got to see good. So there's many moving parts in those environments, but as just again the broad brushstroke kind of thing. If you've got a color accurate volume, and you can prove it with a certificate or a kind of a kind of stamp of approval, that removes a huge element of the potential. We got to redo X, Y, or Z, or whatever it may be, because it's drifted into the kind of the posted and further down the track. It's all clearly not matching.
So that means, I guess, from that perspective, they won't be looking at the studio, the people who own the studio or the LED volume, but they could be looking at all manner of people, right? They could be looking at the DOP because that person didn't know how to, or hasn't got the right experience to be able to light a volume, or it could be looking at the organizer, the company, or the individuals who created the VFX, in Unreal Engine, or the hardware manufacturers, or the people spec to the machines that are outputting it, the media servers, or even the people who plugged in the cables.
It's key to whether they want to drill that deeply into the separate elements. I don't know, but it's certainly an interesting discussion. I'm not too sure whether how valid that is today, in the sense that as long as everything works and you're getting a product and it's all in the can, you could argue that we've got one day to shoot this. We haven't got the budget to spend 4 days getting it all up to speed for certain elements. There's many sort of areas to it. Yeah, as a rule, you'd like to think that the color calibrated volume would be something that would be of interest to everyone involved in the production, because it's not only saves time and money, but people like Unreal operators, and then there's no onus on them to sort of these list of color space conversions and converting this to that and all the kind of bits that are available in the software. Is suddenly, to somebody whose job is to use 3D CGI assets to create, doing part in a scene, that color pipeline kind of conversation perhaps isn't really something that they should be sort of, should be involved in. But at some time, you can see it doesn't look right. It's not right. It's not matching. But where does the needle in the haystack? Is it the OCIO config? Is it this? Is it that? Is it that? And then you find out that the GPU's kicking out 8-bit pictures and it's a bit compressed and it's all doing. So suddenly, sometimes it's not just color science anymore. I've written down here, what's the future for because there's a lot of new roles, color engineers and people. Perhaps there is a future where there's use the focus puller analogy. You've got a focus puller with the camera team for decades and decades. Perhaps there is a point where there's a color engineer, like a Drax engineer would be back in the day with sports,
right?
OBs matching everything, where there's somebody that's just in charge of all that stuff, take the heat off of the other people whose roles are there to be CG artists or delivering scenes to the wall.
I guess there's a role. Part of that role is sits with a virtual production supervisor as well.
Right? There's a hell of a lot of responsibility there, right? You're kind of wearing many hats,
right?
And of course, I'll just pick a silly example again, as this is all very much just us broadly talking about the overall thing. Suddenly ASIS becomes part of the discussion, and then that starts a whole other ball rolling in another direction. So we got to understand ASIS now, and ASIS CG versus there's the color sort of management pipeline with virtual production, because your whole production, this whole scene that we're looking at here is all being done right now in that camera. We're not shooting it out of sequence and bits and bobs and then joining it all together later. All of that information then needs to be. So if it's all suddenly color inaccurate, just, this thing out here is bright red instead of orange, and and it's not going to cut with the stuff that you've got in another bit and whatever.
Yeah.
Or if you have done a hybrid workflow, a bit of outdoors and a bit of indoors, a lot of virtual productions, about a year or so ago, with 20% virtual production, 80% photography, in situ. So that stuff's got to match.
Yeah, for sure. Brilliant. So thank you.
No problem.
Dan.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. That's all right. Is there anything that you're up to? What's your sort of what you're up to at the moment?
Our company Colour Q teaches a lot of colour stuff. We've done a lot of master classes with companies like Disguise and many others, and just discussing colour, which we haven't gone into, but what is the spectral locus? What does it really mean? All the different colour spaces, all the building blocks of a colour pipeline, to understand that bit, to then grow into OCIO and other areas. And we do a lot of work with calibration of volumes, of course, all over the world. And we do a lot of kind of testing for manufacturers and tile testing, sort of under the hood and behind the scenes. We kind of do stuff for manufacturers just so that they can sort of see, well, what is this thing actually really doing in the real world? So we measure it and give them those responses. So yeah, it's great. There's a lot of kind of work that we're doing that's all to do with virtual production and the color pipelines and calibration and measurements and fat testing and factory testing and all sorts of things.
Oh, sounds brilliant. Sounds like good fun. Again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And have a brilliant rest of the day.